Hello and welcome to Colleague Software's feature video regarding the GDPR legislation coming into effect May 25th later this year. This is a follow-up video to an original overview which was sent around late September last year, outlining colleagues' development plans to assist you in being compliant with the legislation. This is a video specific to version 6. Just to briefly revisit this, in summary from colleagues' side, our focus is on 3 key areas. The right to consent states that you must seek the authorization from all persons held on your system in order to retain their data. It is also requested that you provide an easy mechanism in which they can advise either way, and this needs to be done with an opt-in mindset. Non-response cannot be taken as confirmation. The right to access states that a candidate or contact has the right to request a copy of their data from your system. There are limitations to this bound by reasoning. For example, you have the right to challenge a request should a candidate or contact ask for an unreasonable amount of historical data. But you must be able to provide a summarized audit promptly, and there cannot be a charge raised to the recipient for this. The right to be forgotten states that a candidate or contact has the right to request that they are deleted from your system, with any trace of correspondence regarding that individual fully wiped clean. Colleague has previously archived records as part of our deletion process, with the option then to restore that record. So this is a new and permanent deletion process. In terms of our progress, we have now all but delivered the right to consent and right to access components of this project. There are some minor things left to tie off, but it is certainly worthy of demonstration. So we'll now go through a short demonstration on the right to consent feature and the right to access report. Okay, so before we get started, the features or components of the right to consent feature consist of these. So there's 3 new custom fields that would need to be applied. That's to the candidate record and the contact record. There are 3 new history codes which are applied. There are 2 email templates, one for the candidate and one for the contact. There is a custom trigger which is applied, but that's a standard trigger granted. There's a Windows service which is installed on your server, and that will upload the IDs of candidate and contact records into an Azure database, which is the next component along, and that Azure database will contain essentially a custom location of your data mapped to your system with the IDs of the candidate records. That data is then used to map and create a URL specifically, which can be used to take you to a web app or web page, which will allow you then to, as a candidate or a contact, to submit your consent or your denial of consent, and also advise your communication preference. And that data then feeds back into the Azure database, which then feeds through via the Windows service back into your colleague's system. But as I say, I'll just go through the components of it here, but we'll just demonstrate it now. But on the point of this note, you'll note that none of these points are require actual baseline code updates to the V6 system. We've done that purposefully so that there's not a need to upgrade in order to receive this functionality. The custom fields and the history codes, they can all be added as a manual entry. The Windows service is just installed on your server, and then everything else is external to your internal setup anyway. So that's an overview on the components of the right to consent feature. Okay, so what we're going to go through is requesting consent from a candidate record, and what I'll do is highlight the different components of this feature within the different areas that we'll go through as we're doing this. So if I start by opening up a candidate record, obviously I've set up myself as a candidate on this system using my email address there. If we go to the custom fields area to begin with. Obviously this is a test system, so there's quite a few custom fields on this system, but the point of note is that there's a GDPR group against this area, and there's 3 custom fields that have been added here: consent given, consent requested, and response received. So consent given is obviously a yes/no field on the basis of whether consent has been given. Consent requested is a date field, and response received is also a date field as well. So we're tracking when consent was requested, when consent was advised, and whether or not you were given consent or whether or not consent was denied. And that's an overview of the data that we're storing actually physically against the record. If we go to the history area, obviously this is a test record where I've performed this process several times, so you can see that there's been a consent requested history entry created. There's also one for consent received and also for consent denied. Obviously we're just tracking the different types of response and stages of consent that are obviously being logged against this record at any one time. So that's an overview of the data being stored against a record and the actual history logs that get generated through this process. So if I go through the stages of just generating an email and show you how that would work, so obviously you can do that from either individually against a record or in bulk as you would normally. You can click on send email and then obviously that email will come through. If I put on requesting consent as the subject, and then from the colleague tab we've got access to email templates within here, and what we would have set you up with is an email template that's specific to the task of requesting consent from a candidate. In this instance it's been called candidate GDPR request, but the naming convention of the template doesn't matter. Essentially it's just we would have set you up with a template for the candidate, and the same again from the contact perspective as well. If we hit insert on that email template, the template will come through. Now the wording that's used in the template is obviously to be edited to your own preference. We've obviously set up some standard text here as part of this, but what's key to be left as is the hyperlink that is as part of the template, because that's been set up essentially mapping to the master ID that's held on the Azure database linked with your system, referencing the entity type, whether it be a candidate or a contact, and also referencing the candidate ID that's actually linked again within the system. So there's the components of that have been merged into that hyperlink, so that it's a unique hyperlink for this candidate record. If I now look at the history section just quickly, so you've got your email. Obviously we would have an email signature, and you would type other things in there, but if I just look at the email section, we've the history section. There's a history code for consent requested that needs to be selected as part of sending a GDPR request. Reason being is it on the basis of that being selected, it then prompts the trigger that runs to update the date field of consent requested against that candidate field. This is one of the custom fields that we just went through a moment ago. So anyway, we have our email. It's obviously pulled through from that template. We've set the history correctly, and now we'll just send that. So what I'll do now is I'll go to my inbox, and then we'll go through the process of clicking on that link and displaying that, and then we'll return to this record. Okay, so I'm now in my inbox, and we've obviously received that email with the hyperlink within there. So we're going to go through the process of obviously clicking on that link now and then being taken to the associated web page. So I'll click on that link there, and it will take me to this web page that has been set up. So on the point of items to tie off, the branding of this page in terms of it being able to support client-based branding on a per client basis. Your logo is essentially an item that's being worked on. What we have currently is essentially a colleague-styled page that obviously acts as the hub between the Azure database and your own database in terms of allowing the candidate to or contact to advise their consent. So they'll be asked the question, do we have your consent to store your data? Then here you can set yes or no. We'll set that to yes, and please confirm your communication preference, which is obviously on the basis of the mail shot status field as well. Now what we're also looking into is making this an optional extra as part of the right to consent feature when we apply it to a system, as it does have the option of SMS only, and we're mindful that some clients will not have SMS set up as part of their system. So that's something that we're mindful of, again, and just as part of the things we're tying off relating to this functionality. On the basis of the selection, the user can then hit submit, and then they'll be advised that obviously their record has been updated. So from their perspective, their job is done, and the record can obviously, or the web page, sorry, can be closed down. So what we'll do now is we'll return to colleague, and we'll hopefully be able to see that record updated accordingly, and the history is logged against it as well. Okay, so we're back in colleague now. So if we revisit the record we were in earlier, and if we go to the custom fields area, what we'll find within this section, again against the GDPR group, is that the consent given field has now been updated to yes. The consent requested field was updated as part of the sending of the email. When we set that consent requested history code, it triggered this date field to be updated, and the response received has obviously been set to today's date as well. Again, just as that the data came in, to set the consent to yes, confirming that the response received on that date. So we have an overall audit trail of when we requested consent and when it came in, and what it was. Also from the history side, again we've got the consent requested date, specifically the date and time that it was requested and which user requested it, and obviously we've got a log of that email there. And then from a consent received perspective, obviously if it was denied it would have said consent denied, but this comes back saying consent received. It's confirming that the consent was granted, and obviously advising what the mail shot status was as well in terms of allow all, and the mail shot status will obviously be updated based on that preference as well. So that's the audit trail now complete. Obviously from a record standpoint that can now be closed. If you were searching, obviously because we've got we're using custom fields, the consent given, consent requested and response received will all come in under the search as standard, and that will mean that obviously you can do searches on records that of obviously not given consent, have given consent, or perhaps records where consent is not set, but your consent requested within a certain date range. So those records where you're still pending a response from that candidate or contact based on their consent. So that hopefully gives you a means to be able to view your records, and obviously from there either follow up on those consent requests or take due action, in the sense that non-response is essentially an opt-out response from that candidate or contact. So you then need to move on to deleting the record, which obviously the right to be forgotten feature, which we'll come to over the course of February in terms of its delivery. So that's the right to consent feature covered start to finish, and we'll now move on to the right to access report, just giving you an overview of how that report works there. Okay, so we're now going to go through the data access report and how that is run from within colleague. This report is accessed just as the other reports are, from the view tab and then reports. And then within this area you'll find the additional report added, and we've added it here called entity details. Obviously the purpose of this report is to essentially export out the candidate or contact data into a report in a easily readable format, so that you can then export that out into Word or PDF, and from there determine whether or not you want to edit it further before sending it on to a candidate or client requesting the data. So in terms of how it's laid out with regards to the criteria, we've got an entity type of candidate or contact, and you would select accordingly. The entity ID is obviously the ID of the record, so we'll just put in an ID that I've got in mind for this report. And then you specify whether or not you wish to include the history. So if you want to include all of the history, then you can obviously just set that and it will come through. But if you wish to set a specific date range of history, you can do so as well. So if you want to provide perhaps just the history for the last 2 years as part of this audit, then you can do so. What I'll do is I'll select from the beginning of the year, just so we don't flood the report with histories. If we hit view reports, and then we'll minimize the criteria, and then obviously you can see that the report has just simply brought through some basic detailed data from the record, and there's 10 different pages to this report, which we'll just go through. So the standard basic details report will contain just the basic data from the front of the record, or the start of the record. We then go into any notes that you may have recorded against the record, any skills that you would have logged. We've also got a section for obviously the custom fields as they've been logged, If you've got checklist items recorded against the candidate, then obviously those will be displayed in here as well. Again, this is a candidate. We've done this against candidate records, so situations will appear. Obviously, if it's done against a contact, then a situation there wouldn't be a situation page. From requirements, obviously, any requirements associated with the candidate will be listed within the report. And any interviews, obviously, the candidate has been sent on will also be detailed in here as well. In terms of placements, any placements made, they'll be listed there. And the last tab is for the history that's obviously been logged against the candidate record within the date range that you specified. So that's obviously just a nice overview in terms of all the data that you're storing against the system based on that candidate record or contact record. What you then have, as you do have with all the reports, is an option to export that report into various different formats as you see fit. What I'd suggest is obviously exporting into Word, which you can then do so here. And we're obviously using we're using Microsoft SSRS as part of offering the reports that we do. So there's an element limitation in terms of how those reports can be kind of branded and edited in their exporting process. We sort of have to deal with how Microsoft allow us to export the data out of those reports. So when you receive these reports in Word, obviously you've got the data in the Word document, which is obviously half the battle, getting readable data just displayed in an acceptable format in a Word document that's primed, ready to be sent on to the candidate or contact. But there will be an element of needing to obviously brand this yourself, applying your logo, perhaps removing some of the report-related displays, just so that it's obviously as you want it to be before sending it on. So we'll close that down, and that covers the right to consent and right to report functionality that's going to be part of obviously our GDPR project. Just to cover the white paper that I've done as well as part of the right to consent feature, there's a white paper that I've written which basically details fairly thoroughly really all of the functionality that we've done as part of the right to consent work, just for your info as an overview of everything there. So that's going to be available to download alongside this update video, and from there it'll be a case of us moving on to the right to be forgotten functionality once we've finished tying off with right to consent and right to access report. But that concludes our update video, and I hope that was of assistance to you. Hopefully this has offered a satisfactory update on our development progress. If you have any queries or feedback, please let me know. We're also close to the point of needing beta clients to receive this solution and offer their feedback. If you would like to put yourself forward as a beta, let me know. Also, if you have any suggestions or enhancement requests specific to GDPR, again, please get in touch. Thank you for your time. I will include a link to the original video in the description, as well as a link to download our white paper on the right to consent feature for your information. Any other queries, please let me know. Thanks for watching.